All right, so today we're going to be focusing on crimes against the public. And honestly, this chapter probably is going to feel very different from the material that we've learned so far because many of these offenses are not centered around one clearly identifiable victim in the way that like homicide or robbery or assault or kidnapping are. When we study violent crimes earlier, um, the harm was often immediate and personal. Somebody was injured, somebody was threatened, confined, robbed, killed, whatever, right? But crimes against the public focuses more broadly on conduct that society believes threatens public order. Actually, not just public order, community welfare, governmental authority, and just the collective safety in general, okay? So this chapter forces us to kind of confront some of the hardest questions in criminal law because these offenses often sit directly at the intersection of law, politics, morality, and constitutional rights. All right, so throughout this lecture, we're going to encounter laws that regulate morality, speech, protest, gambling, obscenity, drug use, threats, public disorder, national security, all of it. All right. And as we move through these topics, one major theme is going to appear repeatedly, and that is the government is constantly trying to balance individual freedom against broader societal interests. All right. And that balance is not easy. For example, how much authority should we give, or how much, I shouldn't say should we give, how much authority should the government actually possess to regulate speech that people consider offensive or dangerous? How far should lawmakers be allowed to go in regulating morality? When does protecting public order become unconstitutional suppression or, of protest or expression itself? Um, when does national security justify expanded governmental power? And these are difficult questions. And honestly, reasonable people disagree very strongly about many of them. Okay. So I just need you to recognize um, it's you're probably going to have some opinions. All right. Just try to be aware of those opinions. Also, remember this too. You know, crimes against the public, they often change very dramatically over time. So conduct that's considered criminal or immoral in one generation may later become socially accepted or constitutionally protected. Okay, so in other situations, conduct that was once tolerated, might become more aggressively regulated because society's understanding of harm evolves. All right, and that's what makes this chapter especially important because it demonstrates that criminal law is not static. It is evolving every single day alongside, society's political values, their cultural beliefs, technological developments, public fears, and even constitutional interpretation. Now, before we discuss individual offenses, we need to first understand what makes a crime against the public. All right. Generally speaking, these offenses are going to involve conduct that's viewed as harmful not merely to one individual victim, but to society as a whole. All right, so that does not mean that no person suffers harm, but instead the law views the broader community itself as affected by the conduct. Okay, so for example, if someone commits an assault, the immediate victim is fairly obvious, right? But if someone commits perjury, or they obstruct justice, or they incite violence, they do something to pollute waterways or airways, or they engage in some sort of like public corruption, that harm extends beyond one identifiable person. All right. The integrity of institutions, of public safety, of community trust, of social stability in general, these all may be affected by these types of crimes. All right. And this is where criminal law becomes especially controversial because governments sometimes criminalize conduct based not only on direct harm, but also on concerns involving morality and order and fear and public welfare. Okay? Historically, many crimes against the public reflected prevailing social and moral values. So gambling, obscenity, prostitution, same-sex intimacy, alcohol use, and even certain forms of speech have all been criminalized at different points in American history. So just the thing is, there's something really important going on here, and that is that public morality laws often reveal more about the culture and the politics of a particular era than about the universally accepted principles of justice. All right. I feel like we're kind of living in one of those eras now. But that's a whole different story for a whole different other class. Um, but that's why these laws, frequently generate constitutional challenges. Okay. Whenever the government attempts to regulate speech or morality, assembly, religion, sexuality, personal behavior, constitutional rights immediately become relevant. The First Amendment, privacy rights, due process protections, equal protection, all of these principles all appear repeatedly throughout this chapter. Okay. And this section of criminal law contains some of the clearest examples of tension between governmental authority and individual liberty. All right. The government often argues regulation is necessary in order to preserve safety and morality and the social stability. But opponents frequently argue that those same laws intrude too far into personal freedom and our constitutional rights. So, as we move through, I want you to think critically not only about what conduct is criminalized, but also why society chooses to criminalize certain conduct in the first place. Now we're beginning with prostitution, which has historically been one of the most controversial, public morality offenses in criminal law. And generally speaking, prostitution involves exchanging sexual services for compensation. Most jurisdictions criminalize not only the sale of sexual services, but also solicitation. And that means attempting to purchase or to arrange those services. All right. Now, prostitution law reveals how difficult it can be for criminal law to separate out that morality and that autonomy and the public policy concerns and exploitation. Okay. For many years, prostitution, laws were justified primarily on moral grounds. So you had legislators and courts, and they often viewed prostitution as harmful to public decency. It was harmful to social order. It was harmful to the family. All right. But modern discussions, they increasingly focus less on morality alone and more on the issues involving exploitation, trafficking, violence, addiction, and even economic vulnerability. So you should recognize that prostitution cases are far often more complicated than the stereotypical image that a lot of people imagine them to be. All right, in some situations, you have individuals who may appear to be acting voluntarily while still operating under very significant coercion, manipulation, addiction, financial desperation, or even abuse, or even all of the above. Okay. That's one reason that modern criminal justice increasingly focuses on human trafficking. Human trafficking may involve, force, fraud, coercion, threats, psychological manipulation or exploitation for commercial sex acts. And in many trafficking situations, victims may fear retaliation. They may fear, homelessness and physical violence, deportation, or even harm to family members if they attempt to leave. All right. So these trafficking cases, they demonstrate why consent, or I guess I should say more like quote unquote consent, is not always as simple legally or psychologically as it may appear at first glance. All right. Prostitution laws generate major policy disagreement. You have some people who will argue that consensual adult sex work should not be criminalized because adults should possess autonomy over their own bodies and personal choices. Others will argue that prostitution markets inherently create exploitation and they contribute to trafficking, abuse, organized crime, and violence, right? So there is no universal, like, societal agreement on this issue, which is one of the reasons that prostitution law remains politically and ethically controversial. All right, so now we need to discuss sodomy laws and deviant sexual conduct. This represents one of the clearest examples of how criminal law changes over time alongside shifting constitutional interpretation and social values. Historically, or not modern, listen to me, many states, they criminalized certain forms of sexual conduct that was viewed as immoral or unnatural. And that was under the prevailing religious and cultural standards. Now, those statutes often prohibited oral sex, anal sex, and even same sex intimacy, even when the conduct occurred privately between consenting adults. All right. These laws were enforced disproportionately against LGBTQ individuals. All right. So, in many ways, sodomy laws reflected broader societal attitudes involving sexuality, morality, and even social conformity. So that created an important constitutional question. And that was, should the government be allowed to criminalize private, consensual sexual conduct between adults simply because portions of society disapprove of it morally? And that question became central in Lawrence v. Texas. All right. In Lawrence, the Supreme Court held that adults possess a protected liberty interest in engaging in private consensual sexual conduct without governmental intrusion. All right, so the court essentially concluded that moral disapproval alone was not sufficient justification for criminalizing private consensual intimacy. Now, that decision dramatically changed constitutional law involving sodomy statutes throughout the country. All right, so you should understand Lawrence didn't eliminate like all criminal regulation involving sexual conduct. Conduct that involved force or coercion or minors or public activity, exploitation, lack of consent, all of that was still able to be criminalized. But it did mark a major constitutional shift regarding privacy and personal liberty. All right. This section demonstrates something very important about criminal law generally. I'm telling y'all, it's been a week already and it's only Tuesday. Criminal statutes are not frozen in time. All right. Courts constantly reinterpret the constitutional protections as societal understanding evolves regarding equality and privacy and, dignity and personal autonomy. All right, at one point, sodomy statutes were widely accepted and very aggressively enforced. Today, not so much. A lot of those laws have been viewed as unconstitutional intrusions into private life. Okay. And that transportation, oh my gosh, I might have to nap before I finish this lecture. That transformation illustrates how deeply, criminal law has influenced how it's been influenced by these changing societal attitudes and norms and the constitutional interpretation over time. Now let's talk about marriage. Students are usually kind of surprised to see marriage discussed in criminal law. All right, but historically speaking, governments have heavily regulated marriage because marriage affects issues involving, property rights and inheritance and legitimacy of children and taxation, benefits, and even just the social structure in general, right? And for most of American history, states controlled who could legally marry, how the marriage ceremony had to occur, who could perform, those ceremonies, and what legal requirements, couples had to satisfy before they actually got married. I got married the first time 3 days after I turned 18 in 1994. I got married the second time in 2001. And I can tell you that the requirements changed a lot because when I got married to the first one, I had to have a blood test, and I had to, we had to wait like so many days. On the second one, didn't have to do that. But that's all the state's, decision in whether or not they want to change things. They are the ones who have the established rules involving age requirements and licensing and waiting periods and blood tests, and even restrictions on relationships between, certain family members, like can two cousins marry? If so, can they be first cousins or they have to be second cousins or above? Um, Marriage law has always reflected the larger political and cultural conflicts within society. All right. And one of the most significant modern examples involved the same-sex marriage. And for many, many years, states prohibited same-sex couples from getting married. And they argued that marriage historically existed only between one man and one woman. And supporters of those laws frequently relied on tradition and religious beliefs and um, arguments about preserving, historical definitions of marriage, right? But opponents argued those restrictions violated constitutional guarantees involving equal protection and liberty. All right. They emphasized that marriage involves not only emotional commitment, but also legal rights involving, property and healthcare decisions and parental rights and taxation and inheritance. All right. Now, as you can see, it uses the case United States v. Windsor. This case was actually struck down, or I'm sorry, it struck down rather portions of DOMA, which was the Federal Defense of Marriage Act. Now, before Windsor, federal law refused to recognize, many same-sex marriages, even if those marriages were lawful under state law. So the Supreme Court ruled that denying federal recognition violated constitutional principles of equal protection and dignity. All right, so Windsor became one of the first major steps towards nationwide recognition of same-sex marriage. All right, so criminal law and public morality laws, they often evolve alongside, again, the changing societal views. So conduct or relationships once criminalized or prohibited may later become constitutionally protected as courts and legislatures reconsider the ideas involving equality, privacy, and liberty. Now let's talk about indecent exposure and lewdness, which focuses on public sexual conduct and public decency. Okay. Generally speaking, indecent exposure involves intentionally exposing private body parts in a public place or in a manner likely to be observed by others. And the key issue is usually public exposure combined with the awareness that the others may see the conduct. All right. The law focuses heavily on context here, right? So, for example, someone changing clothes accidentally in a locker room is, very different from someone intentionally exposing themselves in a public park, in order to shock or alarm strangers. Okay. The law generally looks for intentional conduct combined with whatever circumstances make the exposure offensive or alarming or, disruptive to public order. As you can see, it talks about Barnes versus Glenn Theater. And this was about nude dancing, and it was a First Amendment issue. And this case raised a very difficult constitutional question. And that was, when does nude dancing become protected expressive conduct under the First Amendment? And when may the government regulate it in the name of public morality and order? All right, so the Supreme Court, it recognized that nude dancing contains some expressive elements, right? But the court also allowed states to impose certain regulations involving public nudity. So that demonstrated an important constitutional principle that you'll see kind of repeated throughout this chapter, and that is that speech and expression may receive constitutional protections, but governments may sometimes regulate the manner in which that expression occurs. Hopefully that makes sense. Okay. Now, hold on. Sorry, I knocked my mouse off. Okay, so it also talks about the Model Penal Code's approach to public indecency. So the Model Penal Code focuses not only on exposure itself, but also whether the defendant knows the conduct is likely to be observed by people who would reasonably be alarmed or offended. All right. And honestly, this area of criminal law often generates disagreement because standards involving offensiveness, they can vary very dramatically, between communities and cultures and even generations, right? And that creates one of the recurring challenges in public morality law. How much should criminal law depend on community standards and public sensibilities? And the answer is there is no simple answer. Now let's discuss obscenity, which is one of the most constitutionally complicated areas involving public morality offenses because it directly intersects with the First Amendment. Okay, so the First Amendment very broadly protects freedom of speech and expression, but you should understand that not every category of speech receives identical constitutional protection. All right, historically, courts treated obscenity as one of the categories of expression that could be regulated or prohibited under certain circumstances, right? And you might be wondering, like, what legally even counts as obscenity? And honestly, that is something that the courts have struggled with a lot, all right? With one court saying, I'll know it when I see it. But this particular slide, it does reference Roth v. United States and Miller versus California. These became the foundational obscenity cases. Now, Miller is especially important because it established the modern obscenity test that courts still generally use to this day. Okay, under the Miller framework, courts look at whether or not the materials appear or appeals to the prurient interest, like whether it depicts, sexual conduct in some sort of patently offensive manner, like under community standards, or and I guess in whether or not it lacks any serious, like literary, artistic, political, or scientific value. I think this is where I'm reading it for the articles came from. But these tests are very subjective. Okay, what one community considers offensive may be viewed very differently elsewhere, right? Another important issue involves the obscenity and the distinction between obscenity and pornography. And not all pornography is legally obscene, right? Adult material involving consenting adults is often constitutionally protected unless it crosses the legal threshold into obscenity under the Miller test, right? But anything that is involving children, that's different because child sexual exploitation material is not going to be protected because the law focuses heavily on protecting children from abuse and from, sexual exploitation. And obscenity itself, these laws demonstrate a huge recurring, tension between constitutional and criminal law. And that is, how do we protect freedom of, expression while also allowing communities to regulate material that they believe seriously harms public morality and welfare? Again, no easy answer. All right, so now let's talk about the regulation of the internet. And I do think this is one of the clearest examples of how criminal law struggles to keep pace with technology. When the internet became widely accessible during the 90s, and honestly, it was more toward the late 90s, lawmakers immediately became concerned about how easily sexually explicit material could be transmitted online, especially to children. Okay. Now, unlike your traditional bookstores, magazines, or movie theaters, the internet communication allowed material to spread instantly across state lines and national borders without any real oversight. Okay, so Congress responded with the Communications Decency Act of 1996, and this attempted to restrict the online transmission of material that was considered obscene or indecent to minors. Now, supporters of the law argued that children needed protection from sexually explicit online content that could suddenly appear in homes through personal computers, right? Critics, on the other hand, argued that the law was too far broad and threatened constitutionally protected speech between adults. All right. And honestly, that immediately created a major constitutional question involving internet regulation. And that was, how can the government protect children online without violating the First Amendment rights of adults? And the courts struggled with this because the First Amendment, protects an enormous amount of speech and expression, including, speech that many people might consider immoral or offensive. The government does not receive unlimited authority to just censor expression simply because it involves sexual content. So, as a result, major portions of the Communications Decency Act were struck down as unconstitutional. Um, that brings us to the Child Pornography Prevention Act of 1996. This attempts to criminalize not only the actual child exploitation material, but also virtual images that were generated by computers that merely appeared to involve children. Okay, that law, it also created a lot of constitutional controversy because some of the prohibited material involved no actual child victims at all. And courts eventually ruled that portions of that law swept too broadly into protected expression as well. Okay, now think about this. Criminal law has, or involving the internet rather, criminal law involving the internet. Um, it is extraordinarily difficult because technology changes faster than legislation and courts can, period. All right, so by the time that lawmakers regulate one form of digital communication, there's a whole new form, new platforms, new technologies, all of those things emerge, right? And today, you have courts and legislatures that continue to struggle with issues that involve like social media and encrypted messaging, artificial intelligence, live streaming, and even, the digital anonymity. Um, Internet regulation demonstrates that central tension in modern criminal law that, society wants to protect kids and vulnerable individuals from, exploitation and harmful material, but constitutional protections still limit how aggressively the government may regulate speech and online expression. And again, that balance kind of remains one of the most difficult, challenges in modern constitutional law. Now we're going to conclude this section by talking about gambling and, more broad commercial morality, regulation, because those offenses reveal something important about how criminal law changes over time. Historically, gambling was criminalized in many jurisdictions because lawmakers associated it with organized crime, addiction, corruption, financial exploitation, all of that. It was viewed as a threat to public morality because officials believed it encouraged greed and dishonesty and social instability, right? So, for many years, casinos and organized betting operations were strongly connected to criminal enterprises, which, of course, further reinforced demands for criminal prohibition. But Let's talk about how that's changed. Today, many states openly regulate and profit from lotteries, casinos, sports betting, online gaming, all that stuff, right? So governments that once criminalized gambling now generates substantial tax revenue from legalized forms of the same conduct. All right, and honestly, um, it shows that criminal statutes are very much shaped by politics and economics and changing social values, um, as by the conduct itself. Now, it doesn't mean that all gambling regulations disappeared. States do still heavily regulate it, for, like the licensing and, fraud prevention, age restrictions, any kind of illegal betting operations, all of that, right? Unregulated gambling enterprises can still create problems that involve like money laundering and organized crime and fraud and corruption. But modern law increasingly focuses on regulation rather than total prohibition. Okay. Gambling is often classified as a vice crime, meaning that it's a crime that involves consensual conduct that governments choose to regulate because lawmakers believe the activity creates a more broad social harm, right? And debates surrounding vice crimes are often very deeply controversial because they force society to decide how much freedom individuals should possess in making personal choices that may carry moral or social consequences. All right. So critics of these same crimes, they sometimes argue that governments should not criminalize private consensual behavior simply because portions of society disapproves of it morally, right? So others, um, how do I say this? In the same vein, others will argue that, the governments have a legitimate role in protecting public welfare, where activities might contribute to addiction or exploitation or violence or, financial harm. And this debate also appears repeatedly throughout crimes against public morality, because questions involving like prostitution, gambling, obscenity, and other morality offenses all force the courts and lawmakers to confront the same issue. And that is, when does personal freedom end and legitimate governmental regulation begin? And there's no universally accepted answer to that question, which is one reason that public morality crimes remain probably the most politically and constitutionally controversial offenses within criminal law. All right, so now we're moving into crimes against the public order, and these offenses focus less on morality and more on maintaining peace, stability and safety within society. And historically, governments have always viewed public disorder as dangerous because large scale disturbances can very quickly escalate into, panic and violence, destruction, and even threats to governmental authority. Now, one of the oldest concepts within this area of law is the breach of peace. That phrase historically referred to, to conduct that disrupted public tranquility or threatened social order. Now, over time, many offenses developed under this more broad concept, including riot, unlawful assembly, disturbing the peace, and even disorderly conduct. All right. These crimes often intersect directly with constitutional rights that involve, free speech, protest, and assembly. And that means that, again, the courts have to constantly balance public safety against constitutional liberty. Now, let's talk about, riots. These generally involve a group of people acting together in a threatening or violent manner that creates an immediate danger to people or property. Now, historically, the riot laws developed because large crowds can sometimes generate fear and chaos and a very rapid escalation of violence. Okay. But not every protest or gathering becomes a riot simply because, officials might dislike the message that's being expressed. So the First Amendment strongly protects peaceful assembly and political protest, even when the speech is controversial or offensive or very, very unpopular. The legal issue arises when conduct moves beyond protected expression and becomes violent and disruptive, immediately dangerous. All right. So, for example, peaceful protesters who are marching through a city carrying signs and, chanting a political message are generally engaged in protected activity. But if those members start setting fires or attacking people or, destroying businesses or threatening immediate violence, then criminal liability can arise. Okay. Another issue that is mentioned here is the failure to disperse. Law enforcement officers sometimes issue lawful orders requiring crowds to disperse where public danger exists. So, if individuals knowingly refuse lawful dispersal orders under circumstances that involve some sort of immediate threat to safety and public order, then criminal charges can follow. And those situations can become extremely controversial because disagreements will arise over whether those, police orders were they necessary, were they reasonable, were they politically motivated, were they overly aggressive? Okay. And many famous moments in American history involve tension between protest movements and public order laws. Okay, so like civil rights demonstrations, anti-war protests, labor strikes, political demonstrations, they've all generated conflicts involving assembly rights and governmental authority. And again, one recurring constitutional question will appear throughout this entire section, and that is, when does protected collective expression become criminal public disorder? And again, it's a line that's just not easy to identify. Now, we need to discuss the whole disturbing the peace, which is sometimes called disorderly conduct, depending on the jurisdiction. Now, these laws generally prohibit behavior that disrupts public order. If it's, doing things like creating unnecessary alarm or interfering with that community tranquility. Disorderly conduct statutes are often intentionally broad because lawmakers want flexibility to address disruptive conduct before, that occurs in many different situations. Okay. That broadness also creates constitutional concerns because vague laws can potentially punish protected speech or arbitrary behavior. Again, historically speaking, disturbing the peace laws have been used to address things like fighting and excessive noise and aggressive, public confrontation and threatening behavior. All right. And I want you to think about the constitutional issue here. People do not lose First Amendment protection simply because speech makes others uncomfortable or angry. Period. All right. But the fighting words doctrine is a little bit of a spin on this. Okay. And this became one of the Supreme Court's attempts to define when speech can lose its constitutional protection. So fighting words are words by their very nature that are likely to provoke an immediate violent reaction or breach of peace. Okay. So courts apply this doctrine very narrowly today because the First Amendment very strongly protects even offensive expression. All right. So insulting language alone, it's often protected speech. Political demonstrations, profanity, hateful rhetoric, harsh criticism of the government, and the government officials even, those can still receive constitutional protection even when listeners find the speech very deeply offensive. All right. But direct face-to-face threats or personally targeted language that's intended to provoke immediate violence might just fall outside of the constitutional protection under limited circumstances. All right. So the legal system generally distinguishes between speech that merely offends and again, speech that creates an immediate danger. And that distinction matters tremendously, okay, because constitutional law does not allow the government to silence expression simply because people dislike the message. All right. It also, actually, let me back up. This conversation was one that took place around a lot of the January 6th stuff. So, regardless of how you feel about Trump or January 6th or anything like that, you can go back and look at the way this was kind of debated and talked about on whether or not what Trump was doing was considered, fighting words. But anyhow, I digress. Let's talk about true threats. So courts increasingly require that threatening speech rise to the level of serious expression of intended violence before criminal punishment becomes constitutional. All right. And modern technology has complicated these issues like massively because speech now, it travels instantly through social media and live streams and online platforms, all of that. So courts are constantly having to determine whether online posts, do they represent political rhetoric, or is it dark humor? Is it, protected expression, or is it a genuine criminal threat? All right. And that's one reason that disorderly conduct and disturbing the peace statutes remain highly controversial, because governments need the authority to preserve public safety and order, but constitutional protections still very sharply limit how far that authority can actually go. Now let's discuss inciting lawlessness. And this is one of the most important areas where criminal law directly intersects with political speech in the First Amendment. And historically, governments have attempted to suppress speech that's viewed as dangerous or radical or threatening to public stability. So during periods of war and political unrest, labor conflict, social upheaval, all those things, right? Officials frequently prosecuted individuals for speeches, for publications, and for demonstrations that they believed to encourage disorder or resistance to the governmental authority, right? So constitutional law eventually developed very important limits, again, on how far the government can go in punishing advocacy or political rhetoric. So we got to talk about the clear and present danger test, okay? Over time, the Supreme Court refined this doctrine significantly, okay? And it's used for speech that is only creating a clear and present danger that can be controlled. All right. So modern law generally protects very abstract advocacy of unlawful conduct unless that speech is intended and likely to produce imminent lawless action. Okay. That distinction is extremely important. For example, a person standing in a classroom arguing that a revolution is morally justified at some undefined future point is usually engaging in protected political expression. All right, even if the idea is controversial or disturbing or anything else, right? Now compare that to someone standing in front of an angry crowd outside of a building while urging the people to go inside and immediately attack the people. All right? That situation looks very different, legally speaking, because the speech is closely connected to imminent, unlawful conduct and immediate danger. All right. And this area of law exists because the First Amendment protects far more speech than many people actually probably realize. The Constitution generally protects speech advocating unpopular, offensive, radical, or even anti-government ideas unless that speech comes across into that segment where it's direct incitement of unlawful immediate action. Okay? And the Supreme Court addressed this most famously in Brandenburg versus Ohio. In this particular case, the court held that abstract advocacy of violence or illegal conduct is generally protected unless the speech is directed toward producing imminent lawless action. And again, it has to be also likely to actually produce that action. Okay? Think about how protective that standard is. The government cannot simply silence people just because officials, fear controversial political beliefs or harsh criticism. Like, there has to be a strong connection between the speech and immediate unlawful conduct. All right. And this becomes extremely difficult today because, again, you have social media that's allowing things to spread like wildfire, right? It's instant and to enormous audiences. So courts now face the difficult questions involving, these live stream protests and online radicalism, political extremism, and digital organizing. All right. So criminal law constantly attempts to balance those two competing concerns, which again is protecting free political expression while preventing genuine threats to public, safety and order. Now, let's talk about threats, even though we already kind of touched on them a little bit. But these are among the most commonly prosecuted public order offenses. And threat statutes generally criminalize statements that are expressing intent to harm individuals, groups, property, public safety, all of that. And a lot of jurisdictions classify simple threats as misdemeanors, and the more serious or aggravated threats can become felonies depending on the circumstances. Now, one example that is mentioned here on the slide is the bomb threat. Even false bomb threats are treated extremely seriously because they cause, very widespread fear. It disrupts public activity and it requires major emergency responses. All right. So a single threat can cause schools and airports and courthouses, businesses or public events, things like that, to shut down while law enforcement actually investigates. Okay. And the disruption itself becomes part of the harm. Now, threats create fear, panic, emotional distress, social instability, even before any violence physically occurs. All right. So the one thing I want you to think about here is that not every disturbing or offensive statement becomes a criminal threat. So the First Amendment, again, it protects an enormous amount of speech, including, satire and political rhetoric and emotional outbursts and hyperbole, right? This is why courts distinguish between protected expression and what the law calls those true threats. And again, those true threats involve a serious expression of intent to commit unlawful violence. All right? Courts have to look at that very, very carefully within the context in which it's said. All right. They also will consider like the relationship between the parties. Is there prior conduct? What are the surrounding circumstances? What's the specificity of the threat? And whether or not the reasonable person would perceive the statement as genuine. All right. So, for example, someone very angrily, like exaggerating, during a sporting event is very different from someone repeatedly sending, detailed violent threats to a former partner while describing, the weapons, the locations, and the plans of what it is they're planning to do. All right. Modern technology has also thrown a wrench into these. It's made it more complicated because, again, you have threats that can occur through all kinds of digital means. Okay, we're talking emails, live streams, gaming platforms, and even more so, you have encrypted messaging systems and you have anonymous social media accounts. All of those things throw barriers up in terms of going after these cases. You also have online communication where it creates other, difficulties because you have sarcasm or humor or intent that's harder to interpret digitally than it is in face-to-face interactions. All right. Tone, passion, all those things get lost in fonts. They just do. Now, at the same time, society has become much more sensitive to threats, that involve schools and mass violence and terrorism and, public shootings and whatnot, because we have so many real world attacks that were preceded by threatening statements that were initially dismissed as jokes or exaggerations. Right? So law enforcement and courts now they have to face constant pressure to distinguish protected speech from genuine danger before any violence occurs. And that is one of the hardest balancing acts within, modern criminal law, because again, you have both public safety and constitutional liberty that are both incredibly important values. Let's talk weapons offenses and firearms regulations. And honestly, there are very few topics in criminal law that are going to generate more political disagreement than this one, because firearm laws sit directly at the intersection of constitutional liberty and public safety. All right. The Second Amendment protects the right to keep and bear arms, right? But you need to understand that constitutional rights are not completely unlimited. All right. Courts have repeatedly, and I mean repeatedly, recognized that governments can impose certain restrictions involving firearms while still remaining consistent with constitutional protections. And the difficulty comes from deciding where those limits should exist. All right. Some people believe that stronger firearm regulations are necessary because guns are frequently involved in violent crime, in domestic violence incidents and mass shootings and accidental deaths. And others believe that firearm ownership is a fundamental constitutional right that is closely tied to self-defense and personal autonomy. All right. So, modern firearm laws often regulate who may legally possess weapons and under what circumstances firearms can be carried or transferred. All right. Now, many jurisdictions actually prohibit possession by, convicted felons or individuals that were subject to certain domestic violence restrictions. Governments can also regulate concealed carry permits, background checks, possession of weapons in sensitive locations like schools and courthouses and things like that. Now, the Supreme Court significantly expanded Second Amendment protections in District of Columbia versus Heller. And this is where the court recognized an individual constitutional right to possess firearms for lawful purposes, such as self-defense within the home. That decision dramatically reshaped the constitutional debate surrounding firearm regulation, because earlier interpretations often focused more heavily on malicious service rather than individual ownership rights. All right. And courts continued to struggle with, difficult questions involving how far, can the governments go in regulating the firearms while still respecting these constitutional protections. But these debates, they remain especially intense because firearm regulations do involve, fear and politics and public safety and constitutional interpretation, and personal identity all at the same time. So, crimes involving firearms, and again, very few areas are ever going to create more political and constitutional debate. These firearm laws, again, they sit at that intersection of public safety and constitutional liberty. The Second Amendment protects the right to keep and bear arms, but again, courts have consistently recognized that governments may still impose certain regulations, including laws about possession, transfer, use of weapons, things like that. And the question is always where that limit should actually exist. Some people believe stronger firearm regulations are needed because guns are frequently connected to violent crimes, domestic violence. You've got the mass shootings, accidental shootings, all of that, right? Others believe that firearm ownership is a fundamental constitutional right that is closely tied to self-defense, personal autonomy, and, protection against that government overreach. Now, historically, firearm regulation expanded significantly during the 20th century as governments responded to organized crime. actually not just organized crime. You also have political violence and, concerns involving increasingly dangerous weapons technology. Okay. So let's talk first about the National Firearms Act. This imposed regulations on certain especially dangerous weapons like machine guns and sawed-off shotguns. So legislators viewed these weapons as presenting heightened risk to public safety because of their destructive capability and their historical connection to organized criminal activity. Now, the Brady Handgun Violence Prevention Act of 1993 established the federal background check requirements in order to purchase firearms through licensed dealers. The purpose was to reduce firearm access for individuals legally prohibited from possessing firearms. And background checks, they remain one of the most heavily debated issues within the firearm policy area, because supporters argue that they may prevent, dangerous individuals from obtaining weapons, while the critics, argue that they burden, lawful gun ownership. Then you have the Violent Crime Control and Law Enforcement Act of 1994. This included restrictions involving certain semi-automatic weapons and then high-capacity ammunition magazines. These regulations generated enormous political controversy because debates over assault-style weapons often involve disagreements about constitutional rights, self-defense, public safety, and the effectiveness of regulation itself. All right. And these laws vary significantly between states. You have some that very strongly protect firearm possession and they permit very broad, carrying rights, while others have much more strict licensing requirements, strict waiting periods, and, restrictions on certain weapons. And that creates a very complicated legal landscape because firearm regulation does involve overlap between federal, state, and local authority. Now, at the very bottom, we see a reference to explosives and incendiary devices. These are especially serious because of their capacity to not just create harm, but catastrophic harm. Okay. So criminal use of bombs, explosives, and incendiary weapons creates very obvious risk involving mass injury, large scale destruction, and terrorism. All right. And again, this goes back to that recurring tension when it comes to crimes and the public order, and that is society's attempt to balance those individual constitutional freedoms against the broader concerns involving safety and violence prevention and protection of the public as a whole. All right. Now let's talk about alcohol crimes. And I know it says drug and alcohol, but drugs will be on the next slide. This is another good example of how criminal law changes over time in response to social attitudes and public policy concerns. People sometimes forget that alcohol itself was once completely prohibited, nationwide under the 18th Amendment during the Prohibition era. And supporters of prohibition believed that alcohol contributed heavily to poverty, domestic violence, crime, moral decline, all of that, right? So the federal government attempted to outlaw the manufacture, the sale, and the transportation of alcohol across the country. But prohibition produced a lot, and I mean a lot, of unintended consequences, okay? So illegal alcohol markets became highly profitable, which allowed organized crime groups to expand dramatically. You had bootlegging operations, and they flourished during this time period. You had illegal bars that were known as speakeasies that started spreading through the city. And then you had corruption involving law enforcement, which also became widespread. And one of the most important lessons from prohibition was that criminalizing highly demanded behavior may strengthen black markets rather than eliminate the conduct itself. Okay, so eventually the 21st Amendment repealed prohibition, making it the only constitutional amendment ever repealed by another. All right. But that repeal did not eliminate alcohol regulation entirely. Okay. Modern governments They still regulate, drunk driving, underage drinking, public intoxication, licensing, and alcohol sales because intoxicated behavior may create significant public safety risk. So, driving under the influence, it remains one of the most aggressively prosecuted alcohol related offenses because impaired driving creates very obvious dangers involving serious injury and death. Okay. DUI laws, they reflect another recurring criminal justice principle, and that is that society may allow individuals, some substantial personal freedom, but criminal liability does often arise when private conduct creates a substantial danger to others. All right. Modern DUI investigations, they also now rely on technology such as, breathalyzers and blood analysis, body cameras, dash cams, all that stuff. And those forms of evidence often become very central issues during prosecution and defense litigation. I'm trying to think what else I wanted to add here. Alcohol regulation. Again, it demonstrates that crimes against the public do involve that balance between that individual freedom against that broader, concerns when it comes to public safety and community welfare. And if you don't really know a lot about prohibition, I highly suggest going and fall down that rabbit hole a little bit and watch exactly how those black markets grew. It's fascinating. Now we're going to finish this out with modern drug crimes. And honestly, few areas of criminal law have shaped the American criminal justice system more dramatically over the last several decades. Drug offenses became a massive focus of law enforcement during the late 20th century. And this was as governments increased penalties and expanded prosecution efforts connected to narcotics trafficking. And substance abuse. So legislators argued that illegal drug markets contributed heavily to violence, addiction, neighborhood instability, and organized criminal activity. And as a result, criminal penalties for possession and distribution increased substantially, during the height of the war on drugs. The law generally distinguishes between like possession offenses and distribution offenses. Sometimes possessing a very small amount of a controlled substance for personal use is treated very differently than, say, someone selling or trafficking large quantities for profit. Quantity often becomes important because prosecutors may use the amount of drugs involved to argue whether or not the defendant intended personal use or intended distribution. One major criticism of drug laws has involved sentencing disparities. Critics have argued that some drug policies produced extremely harsh punishments, and they contributed to overcrowded prisons while disproportionately affecting minority communities. Mandatory sentencing, or mandatory minimum sentencing, I should say, those laws became especially controversial because judges sometimes lost flexibility to consider the surrounding circumstances of individual cases. Now, at the same time, supporters of strict drug enforcement argued that, trafficking organizations, they create enormous harm, because they fuel addiction, violence, exploitation, overdose deaths, all of that, right? And from that perspective, aggressive enforcement is viewed as necessary, to protect communities and to dismantle organized criminal networks. And honestly, modern discussions about drug policy, it increasingly involves public health questions as much as it does criminal punishment. Okay, so courts, lawmakers, communities, they now regularly debate whether or not addiction should always be approached primarily through incarceration or whether treatment and rehabilitation may sometimes produce better long-term outcomes, like the opioid crisis. It especially forced many Americans to rethink these older assumptions about addiction and criminal responsibility. For years, addiction was often discussed primarily as a moral failing or a criminal issue. But today, many policymakers and medical professionals, they emphasize the role of dependency, mental health, the trauma, and the treatment access when discussing substance abuse as a whole. All right. Drug laws, these continue to change rapidly. Marijuana laws being one of the clearest examples. Conduct that once resulted in very serious criminal prosecution in many jurisdictions is now lawful in some states for medical or even recreational use, even while the federal restrictions still technically exist, right? And that demonstrates again that crimes against the public often reflect changing political priorities, along with, social attitudes, medical understanding, and even cultural beliefs regarding morality, punishment, and public safety. All right, now we need to talk about crimes involving respect, honor, and valor. And this is one of the most unusual sections in criminal law because it focuses on symbolic harm and protection of institutions that society considers especially important. Now, historically, governments have enacted laws intended to preserve respect for national symbols, military service, and, certain public institutions. And those laws often reflect the belief that some symbols represent more than physical objects themselves. So, like a flag, a military medal, or like a memorial, right? They can carry emotional, historical, and cultural significance that's tied to national identity and collective sacrifice. All right? And if you haven't thought of there's a huge constitutional issue here, right? The United States is built upon strong First Amendment protections, and those protections even apply when speech or expression, again, deeply offends the majority of society. So, for example, many Americans view the American flag as a sacred national symbol that's connected to patriotism and sacrifice and military service, right? But the Supreme Court has repeatedly held that flag burning may constitute protected symbolic speech under the First Amendment. And that creates some very intense disagreement because many people feel instinctively that desecrating national symbols should be criminalized. So the constitutional issue, however, is that the government generally may not prohibit expression simply because the message is unpopular or it is, offensive. Valor. Let's talk about valor. This is protecting the valor of service members and preventing stolen valor. So stolen valor laws generally target individuals who falsely claim military honors, decorations, or like achievements that they've never earned, okay? So historically, lawmakers argued that these false claims undermine the integrity and the meaning of legitimate military recognition. So military awards often represent some sort of extraordinary sacrifice, or bravery or service. So fraudulent claims may be viewed as damaging to both the veterans and public trust, right? But again, constitutional concerns arise because false statements alone are not automatically criminal under the First Amendment. So courts have had to decide whether or not the government can punish lies about military service without violating free speech protection. And these cases demonstrate something very important about constitutional criminal law. And this is that even deeply offensive or dishonest expression may still end up receiving some constitutional protection unless that speech creates legally recognized harm such as fraud or defamation or some sort of material deception. Okay? So if they're using it to get something for it, that's going to be the key, right? This is about, protecting, national values and preserving the freedom of expression. American law generally is going to prioritize liberty very strongly, even when the exercise of it does make people uncomfortable or angry. All right, now we're going to talk about academic crimes. And students are often surprised to learn that certain forms of academic dishonesty might actually trigger some criminal liability in some jurisdictions. Most students think of cheating or plagiarism primarily as school discipline issues, right? And in many situations, that's true. Schools and universities often handle academic misconduct internally through academic penalties such as failing grades, suspension, expulsion, things like that. But some states actually criminalize certain forms of academic fraud, especially where deception, profit, or organized misconduct exists, okay? Which this slide specifically discusses, situations involving like preparing or selling academic work while knowing another person intends to submit the material for academic credit. So in other words, criminal liability can arise where someone operates essentially as a ghostwriter, or they sell fraudulent, academic work for submission under another student's name. All right. And lawmakers supporting these statutes argue that academic integrity matters because educational credentials, they affect your professional licensing, your employment, your competence within very important professions, and even public trust. Okay. So, for example, society depends on the assumption that doctors and lawyers and engineers and nurses and all those people have actually earned their qualifications represented by their degrees and their certifications, right? So if academic fraud becomes widespread, then public confidence in professional competence, it's going to weaken significantly, right? And technology has kind of complicated academic misconduct enormously. Like artificial intelligence, you've got online paper mills, you've got, contract cheating services, you've got digital communications. All these things make it easier, and I mean easier than ever, for students to obtain unauthorized work. Right? But at the same time, schools and instructors, they have to face an increasingly difficult task of distinguishing legitimate assistance from dishonest conduct. Okay? And that raises important ethical questions involving education itself. At what point does assistance become fraud? How should students balance technology, access with academic integrity? How should institutions respond when students prioritize grades or credentials over actual learning, right? So these questions have become increasingly important in modern education because technology continues changing how students research, write, communicate, and even complete their assignments. All right, next up we have crimes against the administration of government. And honestly, these offenses are incredibly important because the legal system itself depends on honesty and cooperation and integrity when it comes to the governmental process. All right, courts cannot function properly if witnesses routinely lie under oath, right? Investigations, they can't function properly if evidence is intentionally destroyed or it's hidden. Public trust, it's going to collapse if government officials abuse authority for personal gain. So these crimes focus heavily on protecting the integrity of government institutions and legal proceedings. So we're going to start with perjury. Perjury occurs when someone knowingly makes a false statement while under oath. All right. So you should recognize immediately that I'm not saying every incorrect statement becomes perjury. Okay. Human beings forget things. They misunderstand questions. They become confused. And they even make mistakes during testimony all the time. Perjury requires more than inaccuracy. All right. It generally has to prove that the person knowingly lied about a material matter while legally under oath. Okay. And proving perjury can be very difficult because prosecutors have to establish not only that the statement was false, but that the speaker actually knew it was false at the time. So just keep that in mind. Let's see. We also have the to suborn perjury. This involves persuading, pressuring, or encouraging another person to lie under oath. So in other words, someone who doesn't have to personally, testify falsely to commit the related offense, attempting to orchestrate, or facilitate the false testimony itself can create criminal liability. All right. And the truth is considered a complete defense to perjury. All right. So if a statement is true, there is no criminal lie, regardless of whether the testimony, damaged a case or it created some sort of, political consequence or, it embarrassed somebody. Right. And the slide here talks about President Clinton. There were allegations of false testimony during legal proceedings where it became a major national controversy during his presidency. And that example demonstrates how perjury laws may apply regardless of a person's social status even or their political position. Now, perjury does kind of strike at the heart of the criminal justice system because courts, again, they fundamentally depend on truthful testimony in order to determine those facts fairly. Now we need to talk about bribery. And this involves corruption within positions of public trust. So bribery generally occurs when someone offers, gives, solicits, or receives something of value in exchange for improperly influencing some sort of official action or violating a legal duty. Okay. Bribery offenses focus heavily on the corruption of public decision making. All right, so society expects these government officials to act based on law and public responsibility rather than personal financial gain. Doesn't mean they do, but that is what we expect, right? So public trust in government weakens dramatically when people believe that decisions can simply be bought. All right. One important thing of note is that bribery does not necessarily require the corrupt deal to go through. Like, it doesn't have to succeed. In many jurisdictions, the offer itself can complete the crime even if the official rejects the payment, or they never follow through on whatever the action was supposed to be. So, for example, like attempting to pay a cop to ignore, a criminal violation can constitute bribery even if the officer immediately refuses and reports that conduct. All right. Another important issue here is distinguishing bribery from lawful political activity. Now, governments allow lobbying and campaign contributions and political advocacy under a lot of circumstances, right? But criminal bribery involves a corrupt exchange where official action is tied directly to personal benefit, or payment, or payment. So determining where legitimate political influence ends and criminal corruption begins, that can sometimes be, it can become very legally and ethically complicated. All right. Bribery offenses, again, they can also occur far beyond politics themselves. So like public employees, you've got law enforcement officers, judges, jurors, inspectors, and other officials. They all can become, entangled in a bribery-related prosecution. And again, it's because these cases would involve abuse of public trust. It essentially, bribery offenses are, going to be treated seriously both criminally and politically because of where they're positioned. All right. Corruption crimes, they threaten more than individual fairness. Widespread corruption is going to weaken confidence in the legitimacy of the entire, government institution. Not that people don't already have that, but it will just make it worse. Now let's talk about tax crimes. And honestly, this area of criminal law affects far more people than many realize, because virtually every individual and business that's operating in the United States somehow interacts with the tax system, okay? At the most basic level, tax law depends heavily on voluntary compliance. All right, so the government does not personally review every paycheck, every business transaction, or every financial record before taxes are paid. Instead, the system relies largely on individuals and businesses honestly reporting their income, plus their deductions and financial activity that's relevant. Because of that reliance on honesty, intentional efforts to deceive tax authorities can result in criminal liability. Now, there's a significant difference between making a mistake on a tax return and committing a tax crime. All right? Tax laws are often very complicated, and honest errors occur they're very common, okay? So criminal liability generally will arise when an individual intentionally attempts to evade taxes, whether, it could be concealing their income, falsifying records, or otherwise just deceiving the government regarding their tax obligations, okay? Now, for example, let's say that you have a business owner who deliberately maintains two sets of financial records, one showing actual income and the other one showing reduced income for tax reporting purposes. All right, the problem in that situation is not merely that taxes were underpaid. The problem is the intentional deception that was designed to prevent the government from determining the true tax liability. All right. In the same way, suppose that you have someone who receives substantial income, but it intentionally hides it through undisclosed accounts or, false reporting or fabricated deductions. Again, the criminal conduct centers on the deliberate effort to avoid lawful taxation through deception. Okay. And honestly, tax crimes, they're often viewed very differently from many traditional offenses because they're frequently committed through paperwork, accounting practices, electronic records, financial transactions, rather than like physical acts of violence or confrontation. Now, it doesn't mean that the consequences are minor. Governments depend heavily on tax revenue in order to fund public services, infrastructure, courts, law enforcement, schools, transportation systems, whatever, countless other governmental functions. Okay. So when individuals intentionally evade taxes, that harm extends beyond simple financial loss to the government. So we have the integrity of the entire tax system that can be affected. Okay. Now, tax investigations often involve very extensive financial analysis. All right, so investigators may examine bank records, business documents, accounting information, electronic communications, and even financial transactions in order to determine whether underreporting resulted from, mistake or intentional fraud. All right. Proving criminal tax violations frequently depends on demonstrating intent. So the prosecution generally has to show more than just negligence, more than poor bookkeeping, and even more than just a misunderstanding of, complex tax rules. The evidence has to support the conclusion that the defendant knowingly and intentionally attempted to evade lawful tax obligations. All right. And that's the reason, or the one reason really, that tax crimes often involve very detailed financial records and extensive documentary evidence. Prosecutors frequently build these cases by showing patterns of concealment, falsification, misrepresentation, and then deliberate efforts to hide income from government authorities. So ultimately, tax crimes fall within crimes against the administration of government because they interfere directly with the government's ability to perform one of its most important functions, and that's collecting revenue that's necessary to operate and provide services to the public. So when individuals intentionally undermine that process through fraud or deception, criminal law can intervene to protect both the financial interests of the government and the public confidence in the fairness of the tax system. Now let's talk obstruction of justice. And honestly, this is probably one of the most broad and also most important categories involving crimes against governmental administration. Obstruction of justice generally involves interfering with an investigation or court proceedings, law enforcement activities, and just the proper functioning of the justice system. Okay. Now, the reason that these laws exist is fairly straightforward. The legal system cannot function properly if individuals intentionally interfere with investigations, if they're intimidating witnesses, destroying evidence, or attempting to prevent courts from discovering the truth. Okay? And honestly, obstruction offenses may occur in some very surprisingly ordinary situations. For example, suppose someone, intentionally gets rid of text messages after learning that police requested access to a phone, right? Suppose a witness is threatened to prevent testimony. Suppose someone lies to investigators while concealing evidence or helping another person to avoid arrest. All of those situations might potentially involve obstruction-related, offenses. Now, obstruction does not necessarily require someone to succeed in interfering with the investigation, all right? So just attempting to interfere can itself create the criminal liability, all right? Now, this also talks about tampering. This involves influencing or intimidating witnesses improperly. Okay, so witness tampering is, treated extremely seriously because courts, depend heavily on truthful testimony and cooperation from witnesses. So imagine that you have a domestic violence victim who's receiving repeated threats not to appear in court. All right. Imagine you have a gang member who is warning witnesses not to speak to police, or an employer who's threatening an employee who intends to testify during an investigation. In all of those situations, the legal system itself is being undermined. So obstruction cases often become politically explosive because they frequently arise during these high-profile investigations. And sometimes they involve, public officials or corporations as well. Now, obstruction laws may overlap with constitutional rights. So a person generally retains the right to remain silent under the Fifth Amendment. So exercising a constitutional right is not obstruction. All right? But actively interfering with evidence or intimidating witnesses or, corruptly obstructing proceedings goes far beyond, a simple refusal to incriminate oneself. But that distinction, it matters a lot. Now let's talk about contempt. This is one of the most important tools that courts have for maintaining authority and order and respect for the judicial process. So students, you should understand that courts don't have, armies and police departments and, independent enforcement agencies under their direct control. They rely heavily on the authority of their orders and the expectation that individuals will comply with lawful court directives, okay? So contempt power exists because courts have to have some mechanism for enforcing their decisions and maintaining the integrity of judicial proceedings. Generally speaking, contempt involves the willful disobedience of a court order or conduct that interferes with the administration of justice. Now, the key word here is willful, all right? A person who genuinely misunderstands an order or is physically unable to comply presents a very different situation than someone who is knowingly and intentionally refusing to obey a lawful directive from the court. Okay, so imagine a witness who is ordered to appear and testify but simply decides not to show up because it's inconvenient. Or somebody who in a family law case, they're ordered to pay child support, but they deliberately refuse despite having the financial ability to comply. Well, in both situations, the court can consider contempt proceedings because the individuals are intentionally disregarding judicial authority. Okay. Now, it does talk about other types of contempt, like indirect contempt, which occurs outside of the presence of the court. So these situations typically involve violations of a court order that happen away from the courtroom itself. For example, a person failing to comply with a custody order, or refusing to obey an injunction, or ignoring a court directive regarding documents or testimony. These can all create indirect contempt issues. All right. Indirect contempt is going to require additional procedures because the judge did not personally witness the conduct. Okay. Evidence is going to have to be presented establishing that this violation did in fact occur and that it was intentional. Now, direct contempt is going to happen in front of the judge, and that usually involves conduct that is going to disrupt the courtroom proceedings, or it's going to openly challenge judicial authority during a hearing or a trial. Direct contempt is often easier to address because the judge personally sees the behavior. All right, so someone repeatedly interrupting proceedings after being warned to stop, refusing to follow courtroom instructions or engaging in some sort of disruptive conduct that's going to prevent the court from functioning properly. Because the judge witnesses the conduct firsthand, the courts are going to, possess greater authority to respond right then. There is a difference here also that we do need to talk about, and that is the difference between civil and criminal contempt. Criminal contempt is punitive. The purpose is to punish someone for violating the court order or for disrespecting that authority of the court. Civil contempt is often coercive, and the goal is not necessarily punishment, but rather encouraging, compliance with a court order. So, for example, if someone refuses to produce records despite the court order, the court can impose sanctions that are designed to pressure compliance. Once the person complies, the contempt issue would then be, resolved. But honestly, contempt power is significant because the judicial system could not function effectively at all if court orders were treated as optional, suggestions rather than legally binding, commands. It does say at the bottom about the legislators being can exercise contempt power in certain circumstances. Although we mostly, we commonly associate contempt with courts, legislative bodies sometimes possess that authority to address conduct that interferes with legislative proceedings and investigations. But again, ultimately, the contempt is going to exist because the rule of law depends on the ability of the governmental institution to enforce these lawful directives. So if individuals could simply ignore, judicial orders whenever they disagreed with them, courts would then lose the ability to resolve disputes, to protect rights, and to administer, justice effectively. And so for that reason, contempt remains one of the most important mechanisms available for preserving the authority and the effectiveness of the legal system. Now let's talk about crimes against sovereignty and security. And honestly, these offenses are among the most serious crimes recognized under American law because they involve threats directed not just at individuals, but to the nation itself. Now, we're starting with treason, which is specifically defined in the United States Constitution. Now, the framers intentionally defined treason very, very narrowly. And they did this because English history showed how governments sometimes abuse treason prosecutions in order to silence political opponents, or to punish dissent. All right. The Constitution, therefore, limits treason to very specific conduct involving either levying war against the United States or adhering to the enemies of the United States and, by giving them aid and comfort. All right. And again, this legal standard is intentionally laid, and it's also intentionally difficult to satisfy. All right. The Constitution even requires heightened proof standards, which includes testimony from 2 witnesses to the same overt act or confession in open court. All right, so the framers wanted to ensure that accusations of treason could not easily become political weapons. All right. Treason requires allegiance to the United States, and citizens obviously, owe such allegiance, but certain non-citizens or residents may as well fall under that same category, but that's going to depend on the circumstances itself. Okay. Now, one thing people often misunderstand is that criticizing the government is not treason. Protest, political disagreement, harsh criticism of leaders, unpopular speech, those are not treason. Hold on. These are all things that are strongly protected under the First Amendment. Treason requires far more than just a disloyal opinion, right? It requires conduct that is directly connected to aiding enemies or waging war against the nation itself. All right. And honestly, successful treason prosecutions in American history have been relatively rare because the Constitution's definition is so narrow and demanding. That narrowness reflects what we could argue is a deep constitutional commitment to protecting, political liberty, even during periods of conflict or national fear. Next up is sedition and espionage, and these historically have generated enormous constitutional controversy in the U.S. So sedition generally involves efforts to overthrow, oppose, or undermine, the government's authority through force or violent resistance, okay? Espionage involves gathering, transmitting, or delivering information intended to harm the United States or to benefit foreign governments. So these offenses, they're often going to arise during periods of war, periods of fear, and periods of political instability. All right. Now, historically, governments tend to become much more aggressive in regulating speech and protest and, national security threats during a time of crisis. And honestly, that creates a recurring tension between national security and constitutional liberty. All right. Now, sedition involves conspiracies to use force against the government or to interfere with the execution of federal law. And historically, sedition laws were sometimes used very broadly against political radicals, anti-war advocates, anti-war activists, labor organizers, or individuals who had been accused of disloyalty. So that history is important because many scholars and courts later questioned whether or not some of those prosecutions improperly punished, protected political expression rather than genuine violent threats. All right. Ooh, hold on. Now, espionage is somewhat different because it generally involves secrecy, intelligence gathering, classified information, or assistance to foreign governments. Hold on, I'm going to pause. Modern espionage cases often involve things like classified documents, cybersecurity breaches, intelligence operations, or unauthorized disclosure of sensitive information. And honestly, technological advances have also dramatically changed espionage. So information that once required physical theft of documents may now be copied electronically and transmitted globally within seconds. And that's scary. But both sedition and espionage cases frequently involve questions regarding intent. And prosecutors have to show that the defendant knowingly acted in ways
that were intended to harm the United States or to assist some sort of hostile actor. All right, so these cases, they're going to become very politically charged because, again, they're going to involve fear and secrecy and patriotism and public anxiety regarding national security. And throughout American history, courts have repeatedly struggled with the same difficult question of how far may the government go in restricting conduct or speech in the name of protecting national security without undermining constitutional freedom itself. Next up is terrorism, which became one of the defining criminal justice and national security issues of the modern era. Terrorism generally involves acts of violence or intimidation that's intended to create fear, to influence governments, to coerce populations for political, ideological, or religious purposes. Okay? But terrorism differs from ordinary violent crime because the intended impact extends beyond the immediate victims. Terrorist acts are designed to create widespread fear, social disruption, and psychological intimidation that affects entire communities or nations. All right? So let's talk about the federal authority. It allows the Secretary of State to designate foreign terrorist organizations, okay? Now, these designations carry major legal consequences involving funding restrictions, criminal prosecution, and international enforcement efforts. Now, terrorism might involve many different forms of conduct. And historically, terrorist acts have included bombings, attacks on transportation systems, mass shootings, hostage taking, cyber attacks, and even the use of biological or chemical weapons. I was going to say warfare, but anyhow, one major challenge involving terrorism is prevention. So governments often attempt to stop attacks before violence occurs, which means that law enforcement agencies rely heavily on intelligence gathering, on, surveillance and monitoring and interagency cooperation in order to make that happen. All right, and that immediately creates constitutional concerns involving privacy and civil liberties. So let's talk about that balance, right? Because society wants protection from catastrophic violence, but you got the constitutional systems also limiting government power and surveillance authority. Now, modern terrorism investigations are frequently going to involve your digital monitoring, your financial tracking, your undercover operations, your international intelligence sharing, all those things. And just like everything else, technology has changed terrorism dramatically. Extremist organizations, they can now recruit and communicate and radicalize and spread propaganda across, international borders almost instantly. All right. And that's huge. Another major issue that I want to point out is defining terrorism itself. All right, political disagreement alone is not terrorism. So even highly offensive and extremist speech may remain constitutionally protected unless it's connected to criminal conduct, material support, or some sort of unlawful violence, right? But again, criminal law is constantly attempting to try to find that balance, with security concerns against those constitutional protections, especially where we're involving speech and association and religion and privacy. Now, in this same vein, let's talk about what terrorism law looked like at certain points in time, okay? Because the law changed after September 11th, 2001. And few events have transformed American criminal justice and national security policy more dramatically than 9/11. All right. So before 9/11, terrorism definitely existed as a criminal justice concern. And Congress had already enacted laws like the Anti-Terrorism and Effective Death Penalty Act of 1996. But after the attacks on the World Trade Center and Pentagon, national security became an overwhelming governmental priority. All right, so Congress responded by passing the Patriot Act, which was formerly called, it was like uniting and strengthening America by providing appropriate appropriate tools required to intercept and obstruct terrorism act, I think. So the Patriot Act, it significantly expanded that investigative authority for the government in areas involving surveillance and financial monitoring and intelligence gathering and that intra-office information sharing between agencies. Okay. And supporters argued that these expanded powers were necessary because modern terrorism networks operate secretly and internationally and technologically. All right. And they believed that law enforcement agencies needed broader tools to detect and prevent attacks before violence occurred. Critics, however, argued that the law expanded governmental power too far and threatened constitutional protections involving privacy, free association, and protection against unreasonable searches. All right. And honestly, this became one of the defining constitutional debates of the post 9/11 era. Fear often influences criminal justice policy during a national crisis. So governments may seek expanded authority during emergencies, but constitutional systems, must still preserve individual liberty and prevent abuse of power. All right. We also have the Homeland Security Act of 2002. This reorganized federal agencies into the Department of Homeland Security. All right. The goal was to improve coordination involving border protection and emergency response and national security efforts in general, along with intelligence sharing. Okay. The post 9/11 period shows how dramatically criminal law and governmental authority can change after there is major national trauma. So questions involving surveillance and airport security and digital monitoring and detention, immigration enforcement and intelligence gathering, all of these became central issues within modern criminal justice. And at the same time, courts and society, continue wrestling with a difficult question. How can a democratic society protect itself from terrorism without sacrificing the very freedoms and constitutional principles that it seeks to defend? Think about it. All right, we are almost to the end. This is the last section, but it's crimes against the environment. This is an area of law that students sometimes underestimate because the harm is often less immediate or visually dramatic than the violent crimes. But environmental crimes can affect enormous numbers of people over long periods of time. Pollution, toxic dumping, unsafe industrial practices, environmental contamination. These can damage public health and ecosystems, wildlife, drinking water, entire communities even, right? Historically speaking, industrial growth and modernization produced vast economic expansion, okay, enormous. But they also created significant environmental harm. All right, so factories discharge pollutants into rivers. Industries released dangerous chemicals into the air. Corporations, sometimes disposed of hazardous waste with little regulation or oversight. As public awareness of environmental damage increased during the 20th century, governments began creating, stronger environmental laws that were designed to protect both the public health and the environment itself. So let's talk about these laws that generally serve two related purposes. Some laws focus primarily on protecting human health and safety, while others are focusing more broadly on protecting the ecosystems, wildlife, and environmental integrity. All right. Pay close attention. Environmental crimes often involve corporations rather than individual offenders. And unlike traditional crimes where there is an identifiable person that is committing the act itself, the environmental offenses may involve businesses, industries, or large organizations that are engaging in illegal conduct through corporate decision making. And that makes for difficult enforcement issues, okay? Because responsibility might be spread across executives and managers and engineers and contractors and corporate systems in general. And that creates a whole mess in and of itself. But let's talk about the Clean Water Act. So this regulates discharge of pollutants into navigable waters, okay? And it establishes permit systems that are controlling what may legally enter waterways, all right? So this law exists because water contamination can create enormous public health and environmental consequences. So the Clean Air Act, in the same vein, regulates harmful emissions into the atmosphere. All right. Air pollution can contribute to respiratory illness, environmental, degradation, and long-term public health problems that affect millions of people. Environmental crimes demonstrate that criminal law does not only address immediate physical violence and theft, right? It also attempts to regulate conduct that is capable of producing widespread long-term harm to communities and ecosystems. Now let's talk about hazardous waste regulation and environmental cleanup laws, because some environmental harms continue affecting communities for decades after contamination occurs. And let's start with CERCLA. And this is also known as the Superfund, but it is the Comprehensive Environmental Response Compensation and Liability Act. And this law was created to identify and clean up hazardous waste sites throughout the country. And many of these sites involved industrial dumping or disposal practices that occurred long before, there was any kind of modern environmental regulations in existence. All right. And some of these contamination sites became so severe that entire neighborhoods and water systems and ecosystems were affected for generations to come. Environmental contamination often creates a delayed harm. So unlike an assault or a robbery, where something has an injury that occurs immediately, toxic exposure can produce, health consequences years later. All right, you have people who may develop illnesses long after the original contamination occurred. Right? That delay makes environmental enforcement especially complicated because proving causation may become difficult. Investigators and scientists and courts, they all have to determine whether specific chemicals or pollutants caused particular illnesses or environmental damage. Then we have the Resource Conservation and Recovery Act, and this regulates the handling, transportation, storage, and disposal of hazardous waste. So the purpose is not simply cleaning up damage after contamination occurs, but preventing dangerous exposure before it happens. All right? Environmental regulation often involves extensive reporting and documentation requirements. So companies may be required to monitor emissions, track hazardous materials, maintain permits, and disclose dangerous substances. All right. And honestly, false reporting itself may become criminal because environmental enforcement depends heavily on accurate information from regulated industries. Then we have the Occupational Safety and Health Act, or OSHA, which focuses on workplace safety. OSHA regulates, it's about regulations for employees and their workplace. I just had a thought that came up, and I'm so sorry. It was one of those intrusive thoughts where I was being reminded of a story because my husband actually works in construction. So OSHA's at his job sites all the time. And I just remembered one of his stories where a guy fell and oh my gosh, that was so triggering. Anyhow, let me back up and try this again. So these OSHA regulations, they exist because employees should not be forced to choose between earning a paycheck and risking, serious injury or exposure to dangerous conditions. In this particular case that he experienced, he's a general contractor, and this was a subcontractor that was up on scaffolding, and their scaffolding did not have a harness on it to keep him connected to it, and it ended up breaking. And that was something that ended up being a nightmare for a lot of parties involved, because this was actually a sub of a sub. And so there were multiple people, to blame for this man's injuries, but it was really sad. But historically speaking, safe or unsafe workplaces, they did contribute to industrial accidents, explosions, chemical exposures, respiratory illnesses, and even workers' deaths. So these modern safety regulations, they attempt to reduce those risks by requiring safer work conditions and protective measures. The environmental and workplace safety laws, they do reflect a larger principle within criminal law, and that is that society may impose legal obligations on corporations and industries where unregulated conduct, creates serious risk to human health and public welfare, but they're not necessarily going to be easy to enforce. All right, let's talk about some environmental disasters, because some of the most important environmental laws actually developed directly in response to catastrophic events. As you can see here, we have 3 examples, and that is Bhopal, Chernobyl, and 3 Mile Island, all which became major examples of how industrial accidents and technological failures can create enormous human and environmental harm. The disaster in India involved a toxic gas leak from a pesticide plant that exposed hundreds of thousands of people to these dangerous chemicals, and thousands died. Many survivors suffered long-term health consequences for years afterwards. Chernobyl, that was a catastrophic nuclear reactor that, it melted down in the Soviet Union, and it released massive amounts of radiation into the environment. So you had entire communities that were, evacuated, and environmental contamination spread across a large geographic area. And 3 Mile Island was a nuclear accident in Pennsylvania that created widespread fear regarding nuclear safety and governmental, emergency response. Environmental disasters often reveal failures regarding corporate responsibility, safety protocols, risk management, government oversight, and even emergency planning. All right. And honestly, these events changed public attitudes dramatically because people began realizing that industrial and technological accidents might affect entire populations rather than just individual victims. The Emergency Planning and Community Right to Know Act. So this law requires disclosure of certain hazardous chemicals and emergency planning information so that communities and emergency responders know what dangerous materials exist in local facilities. All right, so that transparency matters because firefighters and hospitals and emergency personnel, even residents, may need immediate information if there is a chemical spill or an explosion or some other sort of, industrial accident. And honestly, environmental law increasingly focuses not only on punishment after disasters occur, but also on prevention, transparency, and risk reduction before, it actually happens. Now we're going to wrap up this section by discussing laws protecting, wildlife, endangered species, and animal welfare. And historically, many species have experienced very dramatic population decline because we have, pollution and overhunting. We have habitat destruction. We have commercial exploitation and industrial expansion, right? And governments eventually recognize that environmental protection involves not only human health, but also preservation of ecosystems and biodiversity. So we have the Endangered Species Act, and this protects, threatened and endangered species along with critical habitats that are necessary for their survival. So this law became one of the strongest environmental protection statutes in the United States. These laws sometimes create conflict between environmental preservation and economic development. Businesses, developers, industry, all of those people may argue environmental restrictions limit land use and construction and energy production or economic growth, right? But environmental advocates, however, they argue that ecosystems and species loss might create irreversible damage that is affecting future generations permanently. All right. And honestly, that reflects another recurring theme in criminal law and public policy. And that's balancing those economic interests against the long-term, societal and environmental protections. The Marine Mammal Protection Act. This protects marine animals from harmful exploitation and population decline. So these protections recognize that ecosystems are interconnected, meaning harm to one species may affect broader environmental stability. All right. Environmental crimes are increasingly involve global concerns. All right. So we have pollution, climate effects, habitat destruction, species extinction, all of that. Those don't stop or start at state or national borders. All right. Environmental harm in one region may ultimately affect people and ecosystems worldwide. All right. And honestly, environmental criminal law reflects a significant shift in how society understands this harm. Traditional criminal law is often focused primarily on immediate injury to identifiable victims. But environmental law recognizes that the harm may also occur gradually, collectively, and across generations. And that makes environmental crimes some of the most scientifically and politically complicated within modern criminal justice. Now, before I finish this chapter, we need to talk about ethics because honestly, crimes against the public involves enormous governmental power. Throughout this chapter, we have discussed laws regulating speech and protest and morality, public order, national security, environmental protection, and criminal investigations. Whenever the government possesses that much authority, ethical responsibility becomes critically important. All right. Prosecutors, they occupy a unique role within the legal system. And I bring this up because it has, old Mike down there who was charged with prosecutorial misconduct. But a prosecutor is not supposed to function simply as like a private attorney to win at all costs. They represent the government itself, which means their responsibilities extend beyond obtaining convictions. Their ethical duty is to seek justice fairly while still protecting constitutional rights. And that distinction matters tremendously because prosecutors possess extraordinary discretion. All right. They help determine whether or not charges are going to be filed, what charges are going to be pursued, whether plea agreements will be offered, what evidence must be disclosed to the defense. Those decisions can completely alter a person's life. And honestly, that is why ethical misconduct by prosecutors can become so dangerous. So when government attorneys abuse their authority, they conceal evidence, they ignore, constitutional obligations, or they pursue cases unfairly, the damage extends far beyond one individual defendant. You have public confidence in the system itself that begins to weaken. It references the ABA model rules of professional conduct. These establish the ethical standards that attorneys are supposed to follow. Those rules emphasize honesty, fairness, competence, and respect for constitutional protections. Prosecutors specifically have obligations involving disclosure of evidence that might help the defense. So even when that evidence weakens the prosecution's case, doesn't matter. All right? Think about how unusual that is. In many adversarial settings, people focus entirely on winning. But prosecutors are expected to balance advocacy with fairness because criminal prosecutions involve liberty, reputation, and constitutional rights. Let's talk about that prosecutorial misconduct case with the Duke University lacrosse team and Mike Nafong. That case became one of the most widely discussed examples of alleged prosecutorial misconduct in legal history. So, members of the Duke lacrosse team were accused of sexual assault, and the case quickly exploded. Okay, and I mean exploded into a national media controversy. As the investigation continued, serious concerns emerged regarding how evidence was handled and whether the prosecution acted ethically. And eventually, the charges against the accused students were dismissed, and Nafong himself faced professional discipline that was connected to misconduct during the prosecution. All right. And honestly, cases like this matter because they remind us that the justice system depends heavily on integrity. Courts and juries and victims, defendants, and the public, they all rely on the assumption that legal professionals will follow ethical rules honestly and fairly. Doesn't mean that will happen, but we expect that, And throughout this chapter, we repeatedly discussed governmental authority, and we talked about the government regulating speech and monitoring threats and, prosecuting terrorism and controlling public order and enforcing, morality laws and protecting national security. Because the government possesses such enormous power in those areas, ethical accountability becomes essential. And honestly, one of the most important lessons in criminal law is this. Possessing legal authority is not the same thing as exercising that authority ethically. The justice system only functions properly when the individuals operating inside of it remain committed not merely to enforcement, but also to fairness, honesty, constitutional limits, and public trust. And that's it. I'll get off my soapbox. Let me know if you have any questions. Bye.